On this day, in 1828, a court case took place in Sydney that would invariably set in motion a bizarre chain of events, the results of which would reverberate over the course of nearly 4 years. The crescendo, which ended within the confines of the Moreton Bay penal establishment, will give rise to two of the outpost's most brazen escapes. On the 22nd of May 1828, a man named Owen Flanagan was brought before Mr. Justice Stephen in the Sydney Criminal Court on what may well have been treated as a particularly dire charge. Some short time beforehand, Owen had received a quantity of goods stolen from the residence of James Evans at Penrith, and admittedly, he was very well aware of their origins. On being arrested, he was charged with being an accessory before the fact. Unfortunately for Owen, a new act had only just been passed, which dictated that an accessory to a crime was as equally guilty as the perpetrator, and in 1828, the sentence for theft in the southern colonies was death. Owen's case was remanded for a week, at which time he was brought back before the court for sentencing on the 28th of May. At the sentencing hearing, Owen dodged a massive bullet, narrowly avoiding the death penalty and instead being sentenced to 7 years transportation north to the Moreton Bay penal settlement. Very ironically, at roughly the same time, Owen Flanagan's brother Patrick was also finding himself in some very hot water. Having re-offended whilst already serving time in the vicinity of Sydney, Patrick was also brought before the courts and was subsequently sentenced to transportation north to Moreton Bay for 3 years. Quite remarkably, as if by some bizarre hand of fate, both brothers were loaded on board the same prison transport, the Borodino, bound for the Isle of France via the Moreton Bay penal settlement. It's possible that whilst on their voyage north, the brothers hatched their incredibly daring scheme, or scam, that would slowly play itself out over the coming years. Both Owen and Patrick shared a remarkable family resemblance between them, and upon arriving at the northern settlement, they promptly exchanged Christian names and undertook their respective sentences as one another. By 1832, it was clear that Moreton Bay's new commandant, Captain James Oliphant Clooney, was still struggling markedly in his attempts to right the barbarous wrongdoings of his predecessor, Captain Patrick Logan. A resurgence in unrest amongst the prison population at the settlement through the early 1830s had definitely not aided in his efforts, whilst the absconding of convicts under his watch was still posing a major issue. However, Clooney's concerns were about to amplify tenfold as Owen and Patrick finally initiated the final act they'd been planning since their arrival years previously. On the expiration of Patrick Flanagan's 3-year sentence, his brother Owen, still pretending to be Patrick, approached the commandant and brazenly secured his discharge from the penal settlement, boarding a vessel for Sydney and freedom. Posing as his brother, Owen had miraculously walked out of the jail with 4 years still to serve. When enough time had passed for the vessel to clear Moreton Bay on its way south to Sydney, the real Patrick Flanagan came forward and demanded his freedom from Commandant Clooney. Needless to say, absolute panic ensued. Even though Patrick had been secretly implicit in the years-long ruse, he declared it was far from his fault if the Moreton Bay commandant had been hoodwinked by his brother Owen, and as such, he should be released from the establishment immediately. Commandant Clooney, equally shocked at the audacity of the escape and that he'd been so easily duped, ordered Patrick back to the prisoners' barracks, pending an investigation and the capture of his brother. However, the situation still had some small way to go. Infuriated that his demand for immediate release had been denied, Patrick took it upon himself to abscond from the settlement instead. Conceding defeat and returning a couple of months later, Patrick was granted his freedom and boarded a vessel back to Sydney. In the interim, the authorities tracked Owen down in Sydney, where he was apprehended, loaded on board another prison transport, and returned to Moreton Bay to see out the remainder of his sentence.